What's up guys, today on Dirt Lifestyle, we're gonna go over an entire spectrum of tips and tricks, all relating to fabrication. It's gonna be a whole lot of information. Some of this stuff you guys are already gonna know, some of this stuff you're not gonna know, and I'm really excited to dig into it. We've got a whole lot to cover, so we need to get started. The first thing we're gonna talk about is an easy way to simplify mounting solutions. I'm talking about tire carriers, engines, transmissions, things like that. You need to anchor these to the body of your vehicle somehow, and you don't want to hard mount it. You don't want it to just be metal on metal through and through because you're gonna get a ton of vibration. You want to have a little bit of wiggle whenever you're mounting some parts on your vehicle, and that's where builder bushings come in. This setup is just about the easiest way that you can simplify mounting different things to your rig. We have two halves to the bushing. The bushings fit into a sleeve, so this is 2-inch quarter wall DOM, and it fits perfect in there, or it'll fit in this 1 3/4 tube, which is cheaper and probably more common. And then once you get all that put together, you just slip this inside, and then you can put your bolt in there and it'll protect the bushing from the bolt. So you can cut these down if this is too wide for whatever your application is. They're very universal, and I've used them in a ton of projects. I've got a pretty handy tool that I use every so often, and it's called a nibbler. In this box is a nibbler, and as the name implies, it nibbles away at small amounts of material. So it nibbles away at aluminum, it nibbles away at steel, you can even cut plastic with it. And it's a pretty slick little tool for how cheap it is. It's like 25 or 30 bucks, and all you need is a drill, and you can get this thing working. All right, do you see that little up and down action? That's all it takes, and it nibbles away little bits of material, and makes it to where you can cut straight lines, you can cut circles, you can cut whatever you want. As you can see, it cut pretty dang smooth. I mean, I'm not worried about this cutting me or anything. It's a pretty fascinating little tool. It just nibbles out little teeny shavings. You can cut a straight line, you can cut circles, you can go waves like this. And for 25 bucks, it's pretty hard to complain. Use welding rod to fill gaps. It is much easier than trying to just fill a hole with a whole bunch of wire. All right, so I've manufactured an artificial gap over here. Let's take a quick look at it. And as you can see, we've got a pretty good sized gap there, so we need to fill this. Sometimes you're trying to weld a gap like this, it will just fall in and it'll just make huge holes. It's really easy to burn all the way through. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take some of this welding rod, and this is just standard welding rod that you get at any welding supply store. This is for like TIG welding and stuff like that. As you can see, I did a couple quick tacks just to hold the rod in place, and now I'm gonna take and I'm gonna burn it all in, and we'll see how it looks. Well, it's definitely a dirty weld, but you get the idea. Made it to where we're able to weld that gap all in one pass, and it was no big deal. There was no stitch welding or anything like that. We just burned it all in one shot. This next tip can save your life. Do not weld brake cleaner. It can turn into a toxic gas that is extremely poisonous and can kill you. There are different types of brake cleaner. There's non-chlorinated brake cleaner. There's different types that you can use that supposedly you can weld over. And if you really know what you're doing, then have at it. But I would recommend acetone. It's used very commonly with welders and fabricators because it's very clean. Of course, you need to wait for it to evaporate off before you weld over it because it is flammable. But other than that, it's something that's much, much safer than brake cleaner. And in my opinion, it cleans a lot better. Buy 2 tape measures. So let's say we need to cut some exhaust. We're trying to build exhaust. We're underneath a rig and we're making measurements and we're going up and we're cutting them. Looks like I need to come out probably a 6-inch piece, and then I need to go up and tack it onto like a 45 or something like that. Now I'm up at the table, I'm ready to make my cut, and I realize that I forgot my tape measure. Do you really need 2 tape measures for that? Yes, you do. I'm embarrassed to say that I constantly do this even now after years and years of fabricating, years and years of building stuff. I will still constantly leave my tape measure wherever it is that I'm measuring instead of bringing it where I'm cutting or working or welding or whatever. So this seems like a small tip, and it is, but this can save you so much time and headache. I was doing this even when I was working out of a 1-car garage. You don't have to have a big big shop in order to take advantage of having 2 tape measures. Just like the tip that I just gave you about 2 tape measures, this is kind of the same principle. If you can afford it, get 2 grinders. It will save you a ton of time. I usually use one 4.5 inch grinder and one 7-inch grinder. The reason for that is there are things you can do with this that you can't do with this, and vice versa. Usually I have one set up with a grinding wheel, one set up with a flap wheel, and then if I am, grinding down and I feel like I want to polish it, I can polish it out with this. If it looks like I didn't grind off enough, then I can go back to this without having to switch one grinder multiple times. Another cool thing is that these have the same size arbor, so when this disc wears down to 4.5 inches, I pull it off of here, I put it on my 4.5, and I wear it all the way down enough. I get all 7 inches out of this wheel every single time I cut with it. The next one's simple. Buy a chalk line. This is a construction tool. A lot of people think it doesn't have a place in the garage, but it absolutely does. I've used this tool to save a ton of time in fabrication and making sure that things stay nice and square. Sometimes mounting things on the vehicle and building it right off the vehicle isn't always the best way to do it because it can be difficult to find common points to measure. But if you lay it on the floor, you take a chalk line, you snap some lines on the floor, it's very easy to keep things square and keep things orderly and to even figure out bends, different things like that to make your fabrication a little bit more of a precision process. I use the chalk line to snap out some lines on the floor to basically put together a mock-up slider. Now these dimensions would fit perfect on my TJ. I decided I wanted to use 2 bars, I would have 2 bends and just join the 2 bars together. Makes it to where it's super simple to fabricate on a flat floor. Then I'm not having to suspend anything on the side of the Jeep as I'm going along. And I know that as long as I follow the dimensions that I predetermined, everything's gonna fit great whenever I'm done with the project. What this allows me to do is have a nice bird's eye view of something simple like this to keep it straight. And you can even use some clear contractor's paint to kind of paint over it. Once you let it dry, it's just clear paint over it to make it to where as you're fabricating, you're not rubbing any of the lines away. And then whenever you're done with the project, you can either take some acetone or brake clean or something to the floor and it'll wipe right up. If you want to keep the big tools out of your workspace, you cannot overlook how important it is to put a lot of your tools on casters. The last year or so, I've been starting to put more and more things on casters. Having your tube bender on casters is a must. Everybody has a welding cart, so I know that's nothing new, but I built this with some nice heavy duty casters because I need to be able to wheel that thing around. I mean, even my bandsaw I put on casters. I have plans to put a lot more things on casters, in fact, because it is so nice to be able to move something close to your workbench while you're working. So I can have my bandsaw right next to where I'm working and cutting. Then I can take and I can draw some things out or whatever I need to do. And it just keeps workflow so much nicer whenever you can wheel things in and out of your workspace. I already made a video about this, and that is brazing. Brazing is kind of a forgotten about skill. If you watched a few weeks ago, I came out with a video about how to use these aluminum brazing rods, and I think that this is something that's really handy because these tools that you see is all it takes to stick aluminum together with this brazing rod. Now they make brazing rod for steel, they make it for brass, they make it for copper, they make it for all kinds of different material types. You can even use brazing rod for stainless steel, and this is a skill that I think is really important, and if you're new and you've never done any brazing, I would definitely recommend looking up a few videos and trying it out yourself because this is a simple skill that can save you a ton of time and money, and especially if you don't have access to a TIG welder or anything like that, it at least gives you the ability to do some basic tasks with aluminum and have a little bit of fun with it. We're gonna talk about another construction tool, speed square. This is a very overlooked tool in the shop. I think that this is super valuable. You need to take the time to learn what all these little marks and stuff mean because this can save you a ton of time and help you build very nice square projects. If you are not using a speed square yet, you are missing out on a really good fabrication tool. When I built this headache rack for my Jeep truck, the only tool I used to measure angles and to make this square is with a speed square. It's a very valuable and a very handy tool that I don't see used in fabrication. It's something you see on the job site all the time, something the guys use to build houses, but you don't see people use it enough in the fabrication world, and you can build some really cool looking stuff. You just need to use this really simple tool. You know, these things are like 8 to 10 bucks. There's no reason not to own one and not to learn how to use it. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I'm a huge fan of a portable bandsaw. This is such an important tool to have if you want to keep the dust down, you want to keep the noise down. I don't know a single fabricator that owns a PORTABAND, and to me that is crazy. This is probably my favorite tool in my shop besides my welder. It cuts everything extremely quick. I will cut 1-inch steel with this. It doesn't care what you put in front of it. It cuts everything with ease. It cuts aluminum, it cuts steel, it cuts anything, plastic, whatever the heck you need. I'll cut rubber bushings with it. It cuts so clean and it's dust free almost. It is such a valuable tool to me. It's very expensive. You're gonna be looking at a few $100 for one of these, but it's one of those long-term investments. So it's just one of those things where it might not be for everybody, but it's something you should know exists and something you should definitely do a little research on and see if it's right for you. This next tip isn't necessarily a fabrication tip, but it's a sanity tip. If you have a ton of grinding to do, let's say you cut a bunch of brackets off an axle and you know it's gonna take you a few hours to grind this thing completely smooth and polish it out, I think the time goes by much faster for me if I put a set of earbuds in my ears and then I put my hearing protection over the earbuds. And then while I'm sitting there grinding, I can be listening to my favorite podcast or listening to my favorite music, whatever. I know that's a small tip. I know I'm probably gonna get shit for this tip in the comments, but I really think that this is valuable. Every time I grind or if I'm gonna be welding out for a couple hours or anything like that, just put my favorite podcast in there, makes the time go by that much better and makes me that much happier. These next two tools I don't think have been seen in any of my videos, but behind the scenes I am constantly using a dot laser and a line laser. These tools are so important to me and I'm just sitting here thinking, I don't know how I haven't shown them in a video. I think that I might have cut some footage out that have had these and I regret doing that because this is something that I really do feel are important tools, especially they're fast. So it's something that if you're interested in them, I will have these among a lot of other tools in the Amazon cart, so you can check them out, see if they're in your price range or whatever. And it's something that's definitely worth looking into for fabrication. The line laser and the dot laser are both extremely handy tools for fabrication, but the main thing that I use them for is alignment. Now check this out. If you find a common point on both frame rails, in this instance, we've got this hole here. This hole is the exact same distance from the front of the Jeep to the center of the hole on both sides, the passenger and the driver's side. So what I did is whenever I was setting the suspension up, I marked where center of the hole is on each side, and now all I need to do is take this line laser and just center it on that hole. Then I run around to the other side, I make sure that it's centered on that hole. You basically end up just kind of moving the laser back and forth until it's centered on both sides. Now, what that does is that gives us a common line on both sides that we can measure from the back of the axle. So I'm just gonna push it right to the back of the tube, and then I'm gonna use this line that the laser has put on my tape measure as an indication of how far the axle is away from the center of this hole. It gives you a really easy way to confirm that your axle is in the same location on both sides of the rig. So that way it's not crab walking going down the street or anything like that. There's a number of different ways you can do this. You can do this with different brackets and stuff, and you can use a plumb bob, and I've done that for years, but for me this is an easier way. A dot laser is a perfect tool for if you want to put a grid on the floor and you want to make sure that you can mirror that grid onto your rig. So if we had no suspension, no axles in this Jeep, we just had it sitting up on jack stands, we could make a grid that we could put on the floor. We could use a chalk line and we could clear it all out, and we can mark exactly where there's a perfect line in the front of the Jeep, there's a perfect line in the middle of the Jeep, there's a perfect line for each axle. You can even line up where you want to locate your engine transmission. So you've got this whole system on the floor laid out. You can clear over it, and then as you're doing your build from start to finish, you've got a cheat sheet right there on the floor. The way that I would start that with this rig is there is a common bolt on the front of each frame rail that bolts into the bumper. So you turn the dot laser on, it casts the dot up onto the bolt head, and it casts the dot onto the floor. You take a Sharpie, you mark it on the floor. Now, when you pull the dot laser away, you have a dot on the floor that perfectly represents this corner. Do the exact same on the other side, and then you can run the chalk line across both of those dots, snap a line, paint over it, and you've got a perfect line that will represent the front of the rig. Do that in the back, you do it on the sides, and now you have a big square that will represent permanent measuring points. This makes it to where whenever you're lining up your axle on the jack stand so you can start figuring out how long to cut your links and everything else, you've got this grid that you can really quickly measure off of, and you can put things exactly where they belong, and it just makes it that much easier to fabricate and make sure that you have a perfect alignment whenever you're all done. If you're a beginner, I cannot stress this enough. Buy multi-purpose tools. If you're new to fabrication and you've not bought your first welder yet, I would definitely recommend researching a multi-process welder. This one piece of equipment can do a whole bunch of different material types, aluminum, stainless steel, mild steel, and you only have to have one box. It's really handy when it comes to saving space, and it's really nice to start out with a piece of equipment that gives you lots of room to grow. Now, that being said, you gotta make sure your budget can fit because these are definitely more money than just a single process welder, but it's something that I would absolutely recommend you look into. And if it's just outside your budget, it is definitely worth saving for a little bit longer to make sure you get one piece of equipment that gives you a lot of room to grow and expand your skills. If you wanna start fabricating with thin gauge steel or aluminum, I've got a tool that's probably gonna blow your mind. And that is this 3-in-1 shear, brake, and roller. And what this will do is it'll give you a nice clean edge with the shear. You can use the brake to give yourself a perfect bend. It's also a finger brake, so you can move these teeth around so you can bend a box, give yourself compound angles, which is really nice. And up top here, it's got a roller. So what the roller does is exactly like you think. It rolls material. Check that out. So with a tool like this, it can save you a lot of time. This one's from Harbor Freight. I think it's like 300 bucks, something like that. It's one of those tools that's an investment. If you want to start doing a lot of things with thin gauge, I like to do a lot of things with thin gauge. It can open up a lot of doors that you couldn't do any other way. So if you want to make a nice little shield for some exhaust to keep it away from whatever the heck is running next to it, or if you want to build an intake box or a catch can, this is good for all that kind of stuff. So it's something worth looking into and seeing if it'll fit whatever you're building in your shop. Some of you guys are gonna roll your eyes at this next tip, but every time I show somebody this tip, they look at me like I'm a wizard. They can't believe that they didn't know that this is the truth. You can erase Sharpie with Sharpie. In fact, I think it's one of the easier ways to do it, especially if you do it really quick. As you can see, I made marks every 4 inches on this piece of aluminum, and then at the very end, I accidentally marked it at 4.5 inches. Not a big deal, we don't need to break out the acetone or anything. If you just color it in like that, nice and heavy, and then really quick, rub it before it dries, it goes away. I know that seems insignificant. It's definitely insignificant, but this, believe it or not, blows people's minds, so I thought I would share it with you. This next tool is something that I think a lot of people look at as a woodworking tool, and I guess it is as well, but you can use a jigsaw for more than just woodworking. You can get metal blades, you can cut aluminum, steel, you can cut all kinds of stuff with it. Fiberglass. A jigsaw I feel like is an overlooked tool in the fabrication world, but this is something that because it has such a short stroke, it has a pretty low impact on the stuff around whatever it is that you're cutting. And it's got a pretty decent edge whenever you're done with it. You can just clean it up with a flap disc and you're good to go. This is a jigsaw. This is something that I've had since high school. I bought this when I was like 16 or 17 so I could cut up some speaker boxes and make some custom subwoofer boxes for my car at the time. This is something that I have used for years. This is Black & Decker. It's not necessarily like a high-end brand or anything, but it's one of those tools that if you need to cut around a circle, you need to cut multiple types of materials, it's really handy for that. There's a bunch of different types of blades available, and I cut stuff on the vehicle all the time. In fact, when I was cutting the inner fender liners for this Jeep, I decided to use the jigsaw for that, and it was the perfect tool. With the plasma cutter, if I wanted to cut on car, I would have had to have a whole bunch of stuff behind it because it's gonna be blowing a whole bunch of hot metal fragments, but this was no problem. I just put a nice fine blade because I didn't want it to vibrate too bad, and I just traced around where I needed to cut. It cut the aluminum fender liners, no problem. I smoothed down the edges with a flapper wheel real quick, and they look fantastic. I think this next tip is by far the best way to remove brackets off of frames and remove brackets off of axles and things like that. We all know how big of a pain that is, and I promise you this tool will help alleviate some of that pain. This is one of those tools that an old timer told me about years ago to try and strip brackets off of axles with, and holy cow, is it so much better than trying to cut the bracket down small enough that you can get a grinder in there and grind the axle clean. All you need to do is grind that weld away, and then you can get this in there and you can slowly lift the bracket up all in one shot. And it's a much cleaner finished product whenever you're prepping it for your final grind. So this is something that if you've not tried yet and you're a beginning fabricator, I would absolutely recommend trying it. These actually aren't too expensive, and it's one of those things where you buy it once. You know, I got this when I was like 20, and you know, I'm 34 now. I've been using it the entire time, and I've been happy to have it every time I needed it. If you've watched any video of me fabricating, you know I'm a huge fan of dimple dies. If you're new, you might not know what a dimple die is. Let's talk about it. One big reason I use them is because they look cool. I think it looks super off-road. Anytime you look at an Ultra 4 car or something that's built for competition, they always have this really cool dimple dyed look. But there's also practical reasons to use a dimple die. Whenever you put the flare from the inside of the die into that hole, it helps give it a little bit of strength, and anytime you add a hole, you're subtracting material, which will help you lose weight.
So there's a number of different reasons to use dimple dies. They're not really that expensive. I bought this one first. This is an 1.75 inch. This is the most common one that I use. This was chromoly. I bought it at like a swap meet or something like that, and I believe it was around 70 bucks. So it's not terrible. And I make sure that anytime I buy a dimple die, which I bought 5 of them now, I make sure there's a hole in the center because you can't always take whatever you're working on and go put it in the press. In all of my videos, you see me use the press with these, and it works great. It's really fast. But if you have the hole in here, you can put a bolt through here, and you can use your impact and a wrench to cinch this bad boy down and give yourself a nice finished product.
This next tip is a really good beginner tip for those of you looking to buy a tubing bender, and that is pre-bend a bunch of small sections of tube on the various sizes that you have as far as the dies and stuff for your bender.
I've only used a tubing bender a couple different times since I started this channel 5 or 6 months ago, but if you've watched those videos, you saw I use these pre-bent sections of tubing. There's a reason for that. A pre-bent section of tubing makes it really easy to figure out exactly how and where to bend a bull bar or some sort of a shock hoop, anything like that. Whenever you have a pre-bent section of tubing like this and you write little notes like I did here, it makes it to where whenever you line it up, you can take some quick measurements and you can see pretty close how it's gonna look. Otherwise, you're just kind of shooting in the dark, and it's really easy to waste material as you're going through and just kind of guessing a few different bends. I made these out of scrap tube, but it's honestly worth the money to go buy like a 10 or a 20-foot stick, cut it down into like 2-foot sections, and make a bunch of bends. This will save you a ton of headache, and it can help smooth out your creativity on future projects.
Like I said in the beginning of this video, I wanted to give you guys a nice broad spectrum of little tips and tricks that you wouldn't normally find in one of my build series or something like that. Now, if you're new to the channel, I do have some smaller videos like this that are, you know, product reviews, little tool reviews, stuff like that. So if this kind of stuff interests you, make sure you click the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If any of you guys want to support us on Patreon, we do have a Patreon account set up. And if you want to follow me on social media, I'm at Dirt Lifestyle Nate. We'll see you next time.